Thank you. Thank you very much, Mal. It's wonderful to be here. Mal has become one of my closest friends here on the Harvard faculty, as he has been the most regular attendee of the workshop we've had in institutional corruption, bringing a certain insight from the other side of the river to our discussions, and I've been enormously grateful to for his extraordinary influence and guidance and invitation to be able to talk to you today. And what I want to do this morning is I want to give you three ideas on the way to an argument about what I think we need to do. Here's the first idea. Independence. The framers of our Constitution were obsessed with the idea of independence, but I don't mean the independence of 1776. I mean instead a sense of independence that was increasingly among the conversations of people at our founding in 1786, the year before our Constitution was drafted, at a time when most people had begun to think that America was a failure, that a certain lack of independence and improper dependence had sprung up in the democracies across the Republic. As Jefferson would describe, this dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. This is what government had become. And what they sought were non-dependent, we could say independent institutions that could give the right answer for the right reason. Their common aim was a set of institutions, we could say constitutions, against improper dependence. But what does that mean, improper dependence? Think of an example. We all know what we mean, we think, by independent judiciary. But what an independent judiciary does not mean is a judiciary that gets to do whatever the hell it wants. What instead an independent judiciary means is a judiciary dependent upon the law. And I want to suggest here and elsewhere, this is how we think about independence. To be against an improper dependence means to be for the proper dependence. That's what independence means. Okay, that's the first idea. Here's the second. I want you to see the way trust is a function of independence. So, well-educated Harvard Radcliffe grads, you all know this chemical compound here. This is bisphenol A, otherwise known as BPA, a chemical that's in our environment everywhere, including in bottles like this and in most of our blood systems right now. People ask the question whether it's safe. Most of us think, of course it's safe. How could it not be safe? We have government agencies that regulate stuff like this. If it weren't safe, it wouldn't be in our environment. Most of us are absolutely sure it's got to be safe. But in fact, the research here is a little bit contested, and it's contested in a pattern that should lead people to wonder a little bit about its safety. And I make no representations about this research, just to say whatever you thought before this morning, now you are less sure. Or think about cell phones. Are cell phones safe? 70% of us are sure they've got to be safe. We've had cell phones for 50 years, regulatory agencies looking at these for that amount of time. But again, research is contested in a contested way that leads many people to be less sure after they recognize this contest than they were before. Now, my point is to see the way confidence is related to the presence of money in the context within which a claim is made. Not money in the abstract, but money in the wrong place. My colleague and I, Mahzarin Banaji and I ran a study at the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory where we created these vignettes and we described to people vignettes around certain institutional contexts, medicine, consumer products, politics. And we just designed them slightly, we described them slightly differently so that in different vignettes a conflict was more clearly surfaced. And what we found in each of these contexts was that the more clearly money was tied in the context, the more certainly confidence in the judgment would fall. So in the context of medicine, initially we didn't describe anything about a conflict, then we had a low conflict, and then a high conflict, you see the confidence falls. With consumer products, it's a similar pattern. With politics, it was very interesting. The initial description, people assumed there was a conflict, so that when we said there was a low conflict, they thought, oh, great, this is a virtuous politician that we're talking about. But then when we got back to the high conflict, it fell once again. But what those graphs don't show you is the politics is, of course, at the very bottom of the confidence scale, and these other institutions were near the top, but all of them were susceptible to confidence being weakened by money in the wrong place, as the study concludes. The mere suggestion of a financial incentive significantly influenced participants' trust and confidence, and most importantly, these subtle variations in hypothetical vignettes also significantly influenced participants' judgments of their own doctors, politicians, and consumer goods. And so the point is, the fear of money in the wrong place means a fear of this wrong dependence upon money that weakens the confidence and trust in the institution. Okay, so the lessons from point 1 and point 2 are to maintain confidence in institutions, to maintain trust in institutions. We must secure the independence of these institutions. And to secure the independence of these institutions, we have to watch and be certain that the proper dependence defines the way that institution functions. Okay, that's the second idea. Here's the third. What I call institutional corruption. So here's a familiar device to all of you, maybe when you were kids more familiar than it is today, a compass designed to point to not true north, but magnetic north. But anyway, it's designed to point in a reliable way in a certain direction. And here's a second device, a magnet. And we all have the intuition of what happens when you drop a magnet next to a compass. You get what's referred to as magnetic deviation. A deviation from the intended direction the compass was supposed to point. A deviation, or we could describe it relative to the purpose of the compass as a corruption of the purpose of the compass. Now, I want you to recognize that as a metaphor and think about it in the context of an institution. Think about the way an institution can be steered away from its intended aim, its purpose. And that dynamic I want to call institutional corruption. Now, as Mal described, this steering is not necessarily criminal. It's an innocent magnet I'm talking about here. There's no crime committed, right? So I'm not talking about bribery. I'm not talking about any violation of any existing rules. Instead, what I mean by this institutional corruption is a certain kind of influence within an economy of influence that has a certain effect. So, definition. It is institutional corruption if it wrongfully weakens the effectiveness of the institution, especially by weakening the necessary public trust of that institution. That's what I mean by institutional corruption. Okay, now here's the argument. Institutional corruption has a paradigm case. This is the only case I'm going to assert formally and forcefully we know there is institutional corruption for this institution. This is the institution that is guilty of institutional corruption. Now, I need to do a little bit of brainwashing to get you to this position. So here, let me walk through some examples to demonstrate this brainwashed view. I spent many years of my life, as Mal described, working in the field of copyright. I became an activist around copyright issues on October 27, 1998, when the president signed into a law a statute in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, what the Sonny Bono Act did was extend the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. So the question Congress was supposed to be asking when they passed that statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright by 20 years? Copyrights are necessary monopolies handed out by the state to create incentives to produce something new. But the one thing we've known about incentives for a very long time is that incentives are prospective. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it couldn't advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright, and so clear was that when we challenged this statute in the Supreme Court, we had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winning economist, who said he would join the brief, arguing it could not advance the public good only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you couldn't extend the public good by extending the term of existing copyright. But what there were apparently no brains in this place when Congress unanimously passed this statute extending the term of an existing copyright. What there was more than $6 million in campaign funding from Disney and related companies, all interested in extending their copyright, the public good be damned. Or here's a second example. The Wall Street Journal at the end of last year was puzzled by the explosion of these temporary tax code provisions in our IRS income tax code. They called it extender mania, because what happened is these temporary provisions would come to expire, and then they would be extended again and again. And what the Wall Street Journal was puzzling over is what explains the explosion of these extenders. Well, it turns out these temporary provisions were first inserted in our tax code by Ronald Reagan. His 1981 Research and Development Tax Credit was initially temporary because there was some skepticism about whether it would work. So the Democrats compromised with the Republicans by saying, we'll make it temporary. Then at the end of a period of time, we'll ask the economists. If the economists said it works, we'll make it permanent. If they don't, we'll remove it. So the question was asked after a period of time, did it work? The answer was, it did work. Indeed, it was a great tax credit idea. It spurred a kind of investment that otherwise wouldn't have been spurred. So it made sense. Absolutely, Democrats and Republicans alike agreed. Here's the puzzle, maybe mystery, I don't know, puzzle. It's still temporary. To this day, it is still temporary. Why is it still temporary to this day? Well, as Rebecca Kaisar describes in this article, the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to ensure continuation of this large tax savings. Tax Bites, which is from the Institute for Policy Innovation, describes a little more directly. This cycle has repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election, promising industry more predictability the next time round. Now, the key is to see the way this dynamic is central to how Washington works. We architect tax policy partly to raise revenue for the federal treasury, but partly to make it easier to raise revenue for campaign treasuries, and not just tax policy. When Al Gore was vice president, shortly after he invented the internet, that's really cheap. No, I don't. I'm a big supporter of Al Gore. So after he became vice president, he had an idea about how to re-architect regulation of internet suppliers, cable companies and telecom companies. He wanted to put them under a new title and totally deregulate these providers. His chief took it to the Hill, and as the chief described it to me, the response from the Hill was, hell no. If we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? So we tax in order to raise campaign funds. We regulate in part in order to raise campaign funds. Campaign funds are at the core of the architecture of central fiscal policy in the way that Washington designs our laws. Okay, here's another example. This is a picture of a 15-year-old boy. It's a picture of an epidemic that is sweeping America, childhood obesity. Since 1980, we've tripled the number of children who are obese. Right now, more than 1/3 of children over the age of 2 are technically obese. Now, this epidemic, of course, has enormous costs. But one of the most important is a rise in type 2 diabetes, a kind of diabetes that used to afflict old people only. Now, in some communities, half of the new cases are from kids. as the Center for American Prospect calculates, the total annual cost is $147 billion in additional healthcare costs. So why is it we have this explosion in childhood obesity? Well, it's a complicated question. One important part is related to what we eat. There's a consensus that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. And it's not technically this stuff that's troubling a lot of scientists. It's instead the explosion in a chemical which was in nobody's food in 1980. Now more than 40% of the products at most supermarkets have high fructose corn syrup in them. So what explains that explosion? Well, it is the fact that sugar is relatively expensive compared to high fructose corn syrup. So some people say, well, that's just what the market demands. The market's designed to allocate resources to its most highly valued use, so this is just the way in which we reallocate these resources, but it's not quite so simple. Sugar is expensive in America because tariffs protect the domestic sugar industry, giving them about $1 billion in extra profits every year, costing the economy about $3 billion in increased inefficiency because sugar costs 2 to 3 times the price of other comparable nations around the world. And corn is so cheap because it's subsidized. $74 billion in subsidies in the last 15 years, leading some economists to calculate that the cost of growing corn is actually negative in America today. So if you take 1 plus 1, it's easy to understand the radical shift in the cost of foods. So between 1997 and 2003, the cost of vegetables goes up by 17%. The cost of a Big Mac goes down by 5.4%. The cost of a bottle of Coke goes down by 35%. And it's easy to understand the radical shift in how food gets made. I'm sure some of you saw this extraordinary film, Food, Inc., which describes because we have made corn so cheap, it's now profitable for cattle ranchers to feed their cattle corn rather than graze them on grass. So it's very profitable for them, not so profitable for the poor cattle, because of course their stomachs don't digest corn well. Instead, it stews in their stomachs, breeding all sorts of bacteria, requiring literally tons of antibiotics to be put into their food, filtering out the select few superbugs that are capable of evading the attack of those antibiotics, spreading them through our food system. And if this were a film, we'd now cut to a story of a 5-year-old boy who ate a hamburger and died because of the food poisoning in the hamburger caused by this interaction. All of this because corn is so cheap and sugar is so dear. Now, not only conservatives, all of us should look at this and say, what explains such anti-free market silliness in the way in which we produce and distribute our food? And there are lots of possible accounts, but here's the one thing we know. There is endless campaign cash in our system pushing to this crazy policy choice. ADM, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the subsidies for corn, has spent millions of dollars influencing elections to continue to prop up that government support. And as many papers have reported, there's millions spent by beneficiaries of the tariffs on sugar to keep those tariffs in place. Money at the core of this core fiscal policy. So if it's because of this money, we could say campaign money is distorting the market, which is distorting food production, which is distorting the health and lives of our kids. Or one other example, think about the debacle on Wall Street, which after its collapse in 2008 brought down the economy. What explains that collapse? Well, this book by Simon Johnson and James Quack point to this perverse mix of both too little government and too much government. Too little government in the form of deregulation. Through the course of the 1990s and early aughts, the government executed a series of regulatory changes that deregulated the financial innovations of the 1990s, aka the derivatives. By deregulating, that meant that these were not traded on public exchanges, not subject to transparency requirements, not subject to ordinary anti-fraud requirements, meaning these innovations were effectively invisible to the marketplace. I asked my friend Frank Partnoy to calculate the consequence of that change. He says in 1980, 98% of the assets traded in our economy were traded subject to these standard publicity requirements. Traded on exchanges, traded subject to transparency obligations, traded subject to anti-fraud requirements. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were traded outside of those ordinary New Deal rules governing financial assets, not subject to trades on exchanges, not subject to transparency requirements, not subject to anti-fraud requirements, producing this shadow banking market, which of course encouraged the bubble, which when it burst brought the rest of the economy down. But that alone was not enough, according to Quack and Johnson, for explaining what we saw in 2008. In addition, there was too much government. Throughout the 1990s, the government signaled in a clear beacon to the whole industry that effectively there was a government guarantee at the other end of this bubble bursting in the form of a bailout, producing what is the dumbest form of socialism ever in the history of man. We socialized the risk and privatized the benefit. Now, I know this is not a legal crowd, and this is a technical legal term, but this is an insanely stupid way to set up a financial system. And all of that stupidity, all of that was before 2008. It gets worse after 2008. After the worst crisis since the Depression, Congress adds the insult to the injury here, because after we had seen this crisis, after this crisis had produced the enormous harm that it had produced inside of our economy, after everybody independent of that crisis concluded that in part at least the crisis was caused by this misregulation. People from the left, Joe Stiglitz, people from the right, Richard Posner, the one thing Richard Posner and Joe Stiglitz agree upon is that this misregulation was significant cause to this crisis. After the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, testified he was mistaken in believing the banks would operate in the public interest as opposed to their private interest. After all of that, the banks still had the power to effectively blackmail the Democrats and Republicans alike, to effectively give them a get-out-of-jail-free card, and to leave the basic structure that caused the crisis in place. If the banks were too big to fail in 2008, they're only too bigger to fail today. So why is it we see this insanely stupid pattern of regulation? Well, lots of causes, lots of possible reasons. Here's the one thing we can be sure about. The fastest growth in any sector in contributions to campaigns has come from the financial services sector. In 2010, the largest sector contributing to campaigns was finance, insurance, and real estate. Or let's take one last example. For many of you, when you saw these images of the Deepwater Horizon, wondered how was it you could have such an experimental drilling platform produced without extensive environmental impact and risk studies. After all, in this area, we've just spent 9 years and more than 10,000 pages of environmental impact analysis to be allowed to build this green energy system. So how much analysis was there before the Deepwater Horizon was permitted to drill its extremely deep drills to get oil out of the Gulf? The answer is 17 pages before they were exempted from any further requirement of environmental impact analysis. Now, when Congress heard this, of course, Congress was shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is legal in here. You're winning, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required these fast-track approval processes. And why is it that Congress require this? Well, lots of possible reasons. One thing we know for sure is the endless campaign cash in the middle of these decisions. Now, here's the point. No respectable liberal, libertarian, or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these different political perspectives. So why is it they become government policy? Well, political scientists turn out to think this is unclear. They think the story is pretty complex. They're convinced they can't really show the relationship between money going in and policy coming out. Okay, maybe, but here's the thing I'm sure of. You believe you know. All I had to do is to point at the money. And you believe you know why the craziness has happened in each of these cases. You think it's the money. And this is my point. It's because of this that, number one, Americans believe And I think Americans are right, but let's put that aside. I think this is why Americans believe money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans, according to a poll that we conducted for my book, believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit higher among Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing. We as Americans all believe money buys results in Congress, leading to number 2. That belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. ABC and New York Times calculated last year the confidence in Congress was 9%. 9%. You know, put that in some context. It's certainly the case that at the time of the American Revolution, there was a higher percentage of Americans who believed in the British Crown than who believe in our Congress today. Leading to point number 3. This low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, which registers and turns out young voters and turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of America in 2008, found in 2010 a significant number of their voters were not going to vote, so they polled them. They asked them why. And the number one reason given by far, 2-to-1 over the other high reasons given, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. Now, this is, Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but they will. This is corruption. It's not brown paper bag corruption. It's not Rob Blagojevich corruption. It's not corruption in any criminal sense, or we don't have to understand it as corruption in any criminal sense. It is corruption relative to the framers' baseline for how this republic was to function. The framers gave us what they called a republic, but by a republic they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 puts it, they meant a government that would have a branch that would be dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? So the people and the government, creating an exclusive dependency, dependent upon the people alone. Here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. No longer just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to bring their party back into power, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will raise money. Maybe not on issues 1 to 10, but on issue 11 to 1,000. They shift in light of what they know will bring in the money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes when she came to Congress, she was told by a colleague, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. But it is a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26%. I know you're thinking he's a lawyer, doesn't know how to do numbers, but no, I really mean 0.26%. 1/4% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05 max out to any congressional candidate. 0.01, the 1% of the 1% give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. And my favorite number, 0.0000063%, 196 Americans have given more than 80% of the super PAC money in this presidential cycle so far. 196 Americans. The Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of, though, we are the 99% slogan, bad marketing. Then a 99.74, 99.95, 99.99, 99.9999937%, whichever statistics you want to take to measure their relative lack of influence compared with those who fund the elections. This is corruption because this is not dependence upon the people alone. It is a dependence corruption Just one flavor of what I'm talking about as institutional corruption, the paradigm case of this particular malady. Okay, now, people ask, are there other examples? Other institutions? There are plenty alleged, and what I want to say now does not assert that any of these other institutions are corrupt in this way. I want to just lay out the argument of how they might be. We don't know enough, I think, to say whether they are. We don't know enough the way I think we know enough about Congress. Think about medicine. Think about particular prescription drugs in medicine. In 2008, prescription drug market was about $234 billion. About $20 billion of that was for marketing. And about $12 billion of that marketing was for a practice called detailing. Detailing is the process of giving samples and gifts to doctors as a way to promote your new drugs. As one detailer put it, the essence of pharmaceutical gifting is, quote, bribes that aren't considered bribes. While it's the doctor's job to treat patients and not to justify their actions, it's my job to constantly sway the doctors. It's a job I'm paid and trained to do. Doctors are neither trained nor paid to negotiate. Most of the time, they don't even realize that's what they're doing. Now, whether in fact this is a kind of corruption is subject to a series of complex claims. All I want you to see is that institutional corruption asks, does this influence, the influence of this gifting, change prescribing behavior, number one, or change trust in prescribing advice, because people wonder whether it's the money or the truth that's leading the doctor to recommend one particular drug over another. That's medicine. Or think about the academy. April 22nd, 2008, I had this really terrible experience testifying in the United States Congress. Midway through my testimony, I looked down at my machine, and I've gotten an email from John Sununu, senator from New Hampshire. Senator Sununu wrote in his machine, "You shouldn't be shilling for big internet companies." And I was astonished, thinking, oh my God, he thinks I'm being paid to testify. And then I thought, well, of course he thinks I'm being paid to testify. Almost everyone today in this particular field of research is being paid to testify. One favorite example, a guy had received $50,000 from a telecom company, and then when he wrote his testimony and an article based on that testimony, he forgot to notice to the rest of us that he had received the $50,000. He just omitted it in the first footnote. Now, what institutional corruption asks is, does this influence here, the influence of paid testimony, change the testimony, or change the trust in the testimony that people on the other side might have? And to be clear, I have never been paid to give public testimony, nor do I think any academic ever should be paid to give public testimony. Or think about, Think about rating agencies. Of course, one core part of the story behind the collapse in Wall Street were story around rating agencies. According to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, they said, we conclude the failures of credit rating agencies were essential cogs in the wheel of financial destruction. This is because the agencies had adopted a new kind of business model. The issuer hires the rater. The people who are issuing the bonds hire the people who are going to rate the bonds. Okay. Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission said, because issuers could choose which rating agency to do business with, and because the agencies depended upon the issuers for their revenues, rating agencies felt pressure to give favorable ratings so that they might remain competitive. Simon & Johnson put it like this. Wall Street said, hey, if you don't give me the rating I want, the guys in the street will, and so we got them all, and we'll get them all the business, and they played the rating agencies off one another, or much more colorfully. Imagine the big rating agencies as three competitive saloons standing side by side with each free to set its own drinking age. Before long, 9-year-olds would be downing bourbon, right? Okay. What institutional corruption asks is, does this competition among rating regulators, private regulators here, change the quality of the ratings or change trust in the quality of the ratings? Or think about regulatory agencies. Regulators, of course, are in the business of applying rules to facts. How do we protect the fact-finding process? The Supreme Court addressed an issue like this in a case that they decided, Exxon Shipping versus Baker. In the course of deciding this case, which addressed the question whether punitive damages could be limited in admiralty cases, the court dropped this footnote. Justice Souter wrote, the court is aware of a body of literature running parallel to anecdotal reports examining the predictability of punitive awards by conducting numerous mock juries with different jurors are confronted with the same hypothetical case. But because this research was funded in part by Exxon, we declined to rely upon it. So the fact that it was funded in part by a party who was interested in the result excluded the evidence. Okay. You can read this opinion, you can say that's pretty admirable, the Supreme Court. You could also read this opinion and say it's pretty precious of the Supreme Court, because agencies rely upon studies funded in part by the industries regulated all the time. So here's my favorite example, chemical chromium-6, hexavalent chromium oxide. It's a story told in chrome plating plants called the dime story. The dime story is a story about new workers being introduced to the work they're about to do by old workers who would take dimes and pass them from one side of their nostril to the other through the hole in the septum that had developed because of their work inside of these factories. Now that led some people to think maybe there was something dangerous in those factories. And after a while, OSHA heard about this. So in 1976, OSHA concluded that a comprehensive occupational health standard is urgently needed to protect employees, and they promised to complete it in the shortest possible time, 1976. The regulation of chromium-6 was issued in 2006. The 30-year delay caused by a series of studies funded in part by the industry regulated. What institutional corruption asks is, does this influence studies funded in part by the industry regulated change the fact-finding process or change the trust in the fact-finding process? Or here's one final example, journalism. It's a great book here by McChesney and Nichols, The Death and Life of American Journalism. Of course, people think that the death of journalism is caused by the internet, or by this guy, Craig Newmark, and Craigslist. And this book says, yeah, the internet and Craig had a real effect, but the real decline in journalism happens long before the rise of the internet. As they put it, the big change comes in the late 1970s and 1980s when large corporate chains accelerated long-term trend to gobble up the daily newspapers. And so the claim here is that the change is tied to the structure and ownership. Once they become publicly traded companies, their incentives change. So when their locally based family-owned newspapers were consolidated into publicly owned newspaper chains, an essential trust between journalism and the community served was betrayed. So the claim here is change the type of ownership and you corrupt the institution. And institutional corruption asks, does that influence of publicly traded companies change journalism, or at least change the trust in journalism? Okay, now, all of these examples fit the form of institutional corruption. They beg two very different questions. Number one, proof. How do we know that, in fact, there is institutional corruption in each of these cases? And what should the remedies be? The proof is always going to be difficult. And we run a lab at the Edmund J. Safra Center trying to understand how we could make such proof. The remedies are not always difficult. Or at least some remedies, we could say, are at least conceptually simple. So let's go back to our paradigm example of Congress. If there's a systemic problem here, that the funders are not the people, there's a systemic solution. The solution to make the funders the people. To give them away, and it looks a little bit like give Congress away. I don't quite mean that, although a lot of people want to do that. No, but I mean give Congress a way to fund without Faust, without selling their souls, without alienating America by leading America to believe they've sold their souls to get their funding. And the one way to do this, and I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to openly and firmly and strongly embrace the idea of what I'm going to call citizen-funded campaigns. Okay, so you think, well, what does citizen-funded campaigns mean? The first fact is we've got to recognize campaigns have to be funded. The internet's not going to make them all free. Okay, but the question is, funded by whom? Should they be funded by citizens or by non-citizens? The Chinese, the French, whether or not corporations are persons, nobody has ever said a corporation is a citizen. Okay, so most people, when you frame it like this, say, between citizens and non-citizens, we pick citizens. But that leads to a second question. Which citizens? Some citizens or all citizens? Because the current way we fund elections is a kind of citizen-funded election, where it's just some citizens who fund the election. Large dollar-funded campaigns funded by a small percentage of America, 0.26, 0.05, 0.01, produce this enormous gap in influence. This is the per capita contribution based on income levels. There are people down here, they're just very small. This is the top 1%. The top 1% in America gives 10 times per capita in contributions as the 99% below. Now you should look at that. I think it's a little bit weird, right? If you think about the elections that America conducts, we actually conduct two different kinds of elections: a voter election and a money election. The voter election happens twice a cycle, the primary and the general. The money election happens continuously. Every single day, people are deciding with their dollars who to support. In the voting election, the Supreme Court has said the influence has got to be absolutely equal. If two congressional districts are drawn in a way that gives more power to one set of voters in one district than the other, the Constitution says redraw the lines to make sure absolute equality, as much as is possible. But in the money election, there's a radical inequality, and it's completely unnoticed and unadjudicatable in the Supreme Court. Doesn't matter. This influence, radical inequality, doesn't matter. And that's the consequence of funding elections by the tiniest slice of the 1%, producing this type of impression of what these elections are. So when I talk about citizen-funded elections, I don't mean those. But that leads many people to the opposite extreme, what's typically referred to as public funding of elections. So public funding is like the Federal Election Commission, which is by most Americans just hated. Hated because some people say this is government control of the amount of money people can spend. Conservatives are upset because they say this is my money subsidizing your speech. And all of us are frustrated about what we see, this kind of bloated bureaucratic system at the core of our democracy. So when I talk about citizen-funded elections, I also don't mean to refer to what you typically refer to as public funding, this kind of top-down system for funding elections. But fortunately, I've left some space in the middle here, right? So there's an opportunity for something between them. And what I want to get you to see is that there's another category of funding out there, what we could call a bottom-up system that tries to enlist all of us in funding elections. These are voluntary, small-dollar funded campaigns, where candidates opt into a system where they take small-dollar contributions only, but the system, the government system, then amplifies those contributions so that they can afford to run winning campaigns, never taking large contributions from anyone. There are many versions of this. We have 3 states in the nation that run their state governments with this kind of election: Arizona and Maine and Connecticut. When Connecticut adopted the system, in its first year, 78% of the elected representatives opted into a system where they took small contributions only, took no large contributions, Democrats and Republicans alike, because it turned out that was a more sensible way to run winning elections than the old system of raising money from the tiniest slice of the 1%. Now, that type of system answers the conservative concern about government control over the amount of money people get to spend, because the amount of money you get to spend is totally dependent upon how many people you convince to contribute to your campaign, amplified by the government, but it's a popular choice directly by that contribution. It doesn't answer the concern that my money is subsidizing your speech, because the matching grants are so large that often people can say the matching grants are a way of you having your speech subsidized with my money. So that led me in my book, Republic Lost, to think, could we try to solve the problem of my money subsidizing your speech, consistent with the idea of small dollar funded campaigns? And so I came up with what I called this the Grant and Franklin Project. So here's the way Grant and Franklin Project works. You've got to assume with me, and we could prove it, but I won't here. Let's assume with me for a second that all Americans contribute, in quotes, at least $50 to the federal treasury, whether it's through income tax or Social Security tax or cigarette tax or gasoline tax, whatever. All of us send at least $50 to the federal treasury. So take that first $50 and rebate it in the form of a democracy voucher. So the voucher you can give to candidates, parts of it or all of it, as long as those candidates agree to fund their campaigns only with vouchers, plus contributions limited to $100 per citizen. So Grant, $50, Franklin, $100. Okay. $50 a voter is $7 billion. The total amount raised in 2010 was $1.8 billion. So Grant and Franklin would give us, at the most, 3 times the amount raised and spent in 2010. So it's real money inside the system. But what's significant about it is it's representative. It's money coming from all of us as opposed to the tiniest slice of the 1%. So when I talk about citizen-funded elections, what I'm talking about is a program like this, where only citizens and all citizens are funding, so that when Congress is dependent upon their funders, they are also, therefore, dependent upon the people. All right. So conceptually, it's simple to see how to solve that particular instance of institutional corruption, but conceptually simple does not mean easy. So a graduate of our law school, Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, who's been in Congress for as long as all about 20 other members of Congress, tried to make me see this very clearly by giving me the following way to understand Washington. He said, you've got to understand Capitol Hill is increasingly a, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street, where the lobbyists live, a farm league for K Street. What he said is, members and staffers and bureaucrats increasingly, today, not in the history of America, but today, increasingly have a common business model. The business model is a model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated that between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. United Republic calculates that the average increase in salary for a congressman going to become a lobbyist, 1,452%. So in a world where everyone inside that beltway depends upon this system surviving for their retirement, for their kids' education, for their future, how could we ever imagine them changing this system? So though this is simple conceptually, it might be that change is impossible given the structure of incentives that are there. But not all of the instances of institutional corruption that I've described are even conceptually simple to solve. So if there's a problem with the way we fund drug development, citizen-funded campaigns may be cheap, but citizen-funded research would not be cheap. There's no way the government's going to come in and fund all of the clinical trials that go into drug development. It's just not feasible. So if we want to think about a way to deal with that problem, assuming that is a problem, we've got to think of a different way to deal with it. It would be relatively easy to think about regulations that would restructure the way those rating agencies worked. But in the context of journalism, it's not easy to think about what a solution would be, because a First Amendment to our Constitution makes it that Congress can't pass any law that is going to affect the speech of the press in a way that would interfere and balance the kind of corruption that I think we've seen right now. So the remedies are complex, but the first and important point here is that if the institution is important, it becomes incumbent upon us, if their function is important, if their trust is important, to focus on how we can restore the independence, to restore their function, and restore their public trust. Okay. Now, I want to make one final point before I stop. People say, why are you so interested in talking about many institutions? Why don't you just stay with one, Congress? And I think the point is that it becomes easier to see institutional corruption when you look out across the different institutions, these different republics, these different institutions. You'll never see it about your own institution, but you'll always see it about other institutions. So we all, there might be a couple of congressmen here, but we all see it about Congress. Okay, we all see it about Congress. But, you know, if you're from the medical institutions, you might not see it about medicine, you might not see it about business, whatever. But the point is, you can recognize it by looking at it elsewhere. And we begin to see, as you see all of these different institutions that have the same dynamic inside them, we can describe them as these different republics increasingly lost. That's why. But that leads to what we should be doing about it. And I focus on it like this because I think this makes salient an important conception of responsibility. And here's where I want to end. I'm sure many of you remember the images of this disaster. March 1989, and a ship commanded by Captain Joseph Hazelwood, ran aground in Prince William Sound, spilled about 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean. This is Captain Hazelwood calling in the accident.
Yeah, it's Valdez back. You should be on the radar there. We fetched up on the ground north of Goose Island, Boy Reef. And evidently, we get some oil. And we're going to be here for a while.
if you want, so you're notified, over. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering what people wondered after that accident, which was Captain Joseph Hazelwood intoxicated at the time that he was captaining a supertanker? He denied it. He said he'd only had 4 vodkas before he'd gotten on the ship. Blood alcohol levels said he must have been at least 6 times the legal limit when he got on board. But his lawyers fought it. There was big litigation about it. He was not convicted. So let's say there was some doubt about whether he was drunk at the time he was captaining the supertanker. What there was no doubt about was that he had a problem with alcohol. His mother testified he'd had a problem with alcohol. In 1985, 4 years before the accident, Exxon had treated him for his alcohol problem. After the accident, Exxon's president said he thought he had mastered his problem. But in 1986, 3 years before the accident, his driver's license was revoked for a DUI. In 1988, a year before the accident, his driver's license was again revoked for a DUI. At the time he was captaining a supertanker, he was not allowed to drive a VW Beetle. Okay, but again, forget about Hazelwood. What I want you to do is think about those around Captain Hazelwood. I want you to think about the other officers who could have picked up a phone while a drunk was driving a supertanker. I want you to think about those who did nothing. What do we think about them? Because I ask this question because as I think about this problem of institutional corruption, in all of the different domains in which it might be existing and most pronounced in the context of Congress, I increasingly think we are they. We are those officers who don't pick up the phone. We face these critical problems requiring serious attention, but we have institutions incapable of that attention, distracted, unable to focus. Like a pilot playing on his laptop while flying a plane, a surgeon flirting during surgery, half of you on your cell phone when you're driving. Critical problems facing our society requiring serious attention, but none of the institutions capable of giving them that attention. And who is to blame for that? Who is responsible? It's too easy to focus on the evil people as responsible. Of course, they're responsible. But it's not just them. It's the good people. It's the decent people. The people who could have picked up a phone. It's us. We, the most privileged, are responsible for fixing this. Because the most outrageous part is that these corruptions may have been primed by the most privileged, but they were permitted by the passivity of the most privileged as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. I think I want to let this settle here, but we do have some mics. We want to entertain discourse and conversation. Larry is still with us for a little while, so if any of you have comments, would like to move to a mic, please feel free to do so. It might be nice just to introduce yourself before you speak, give your name, and a class is not necessary. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Bruce Johnstone, and met with many congressmen, many congresswomen. And every one of them says that the biggest problem is one that you didn't mention, which is that our form of government requires that they be re-elected every 2 years. And they say that as soon as they get elected, the very first thing they do, the very next morning, is run for re-election. And it's the most important thing they do. It's always on their mind. Now, maybe you didn't mention it because it's just impossible to deal with. But I'm afraid that our form of government almost guarantees that what you describe is going to be with us forever.
So I agree that the problem we've got today is intimately tied to the fact that it's perpetual campaigning. When I was living in California, my congressman died. There was a draft lessig movement started out here that tried to get me to run for Congress. And Joe Trippi flew in and he appeared on my doorstep and he said, "I'll run your campaign." And I said, "Well, let's talk about it, Joe." So he sat down in my living room and he said, "Okay, here's the deal. You've got to be willing every single day that you're in Congress to get up in the morning and spend 2 to 4 hours on the telephone calling people you've never met, asking for money. If you're not willing to do that, you should not be running for Congress." So that's absolutely true. But the reason I don't think that's the root here is that that's actually changed. It hasn't been the case that forever in the history of the United States, Congress has run for Congress every single moment of their time in Congress. Instead, that pattern of running for Congress every single moment they're in Congress has only occurred as the fundraising game has gone through the roof. And indeed, as I try to argue in my book, it's relatively recently. It's basically after Congress becomes competitive, after Newt Gingrich becomes the speaker, that the pattern changes dramatically. And so I want to start by saying, let's just change the way we fund it so that they're not spending 30 to 70% of their time raising money. And let's see if that gets us to a place where they can afford to do what Congress had done for the previous 187 years. And if it's not enough, I'm willing to say, let's then think about the next step we've got to take. Because the fact of regular elections means you can plan your campaigns, so you campaign all the time. But in countries like Britain, where the elections are sporadic, it's all going to be right around the period of time before the election. So I'm willing to entertain that as a problem, but I want to address the thing that's so clearly tied to the problem that we've seen and then see whether the problem remains. Yeah.
I wonder if there's something else you might think about that, which is maybe it might be possible to make less money necessary in campaigns. For example, if you had a better educated electorate, maybe you wouldn't need all this money for negative advertising. The electorate wouldn't believe all this nonsense.
So I just say that the cost of running my Grant and Franklin project of $7 billion every election cycle is much less than the cost of educating the electorate to get to the position that. But again, I'm not opposed to saying we have to think about ways in which we have to change the dynamic of politics so it's not as destructive as it is right now. When I'm identifying what I think of as the root, the money in the problem, that's not to say that's the only problem. It's to say that we've got to solve one problem that is generative of solving other problems. So Henry David Thoreau wrote on Walden, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one striking at the root. What I'm trying to do is to get people to hack less at the branches of evil and recognize this root. And this root is the thing that makes it so we could begin to have a democracy that other people want to engage to fix the other enormous problems that exist inside this system. Yes, sir.
My name is Roy Hubby. You focus mostly on fundraising part of this. But I wonder if some focus should be given to the way money is spent. I'm very interested in French politics, and I follow French politics very closely. They just had a presidential election in France, as you know. But one of the interesting things about French politics is that in France, no political broadcasting, television or radio is allowed. There are no negative ads, there are positive ads, there's nothing on television or on the radio or broadcast that is political advertising. A certain amount of time is made available free to candidates for presentation, and if there are political interviews with candidates, the time is clearly regulated, so every candidate is interviewed at the exact same amount of time. So in that case, money is much less important in French elections. You don't need to raise vast sums. Campaigning is done by rallies, by rounding, things like that. So the spending annual needs perhaps be considered as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. Making those changes, rules that banned television advertising, radio advertising, rules that required equal time, would dramatically change the spending. But the Supreme Court has made it clear all of those rules are unconstitutional. So you could think about amending the First Amendment to permit that, but amending the First Amendment requires at least 67 votes in the United States Senate, or 34 states calling for a convention, and I just don't think we're going to get the movement we need around that particular change. So I want to talk about changes that don't require 67 votes in the Senate. So the Grant and Franklin Project is a simple bill. It is not perfectly constitutional. Even under the Roberts Court, it's perfectly constitutional, and it might begin to get us into a place where the consequences of the other problems we've identified are not as significant. Yes,
My name is Kent Barrett. You mentioned Arizona as having public funding. Being from Tucson, Arizona, I look desperately for something in Arizona's legislature to be proud of. Unfortunately, public funding isn't required. And so while it has a certain moral advantage to say we're getting public funding, since it's not required, ultimately, and it encourages new candidates who might not have the connections to have high funding. Candidates look for where they're going to get the most money, and they get out-of-state money. It has not, because it's not required, the perversion of money, the corruption of money still exists there.
Well, sorry. Mm-hmm.
And that is, given your experience with Justice Scalia, would you share